Welcome to this very special Lowell Lecture. As we begin, I want to give first thanks to Mark Jordan, who will be introduced by Brian Stone, but I've known Mark a long time. And I want you to know that having him here with us is a treasure. Mark is a man I know to be a warm-hearted support for the people with whom he works and the people whom he loves. He's a man who has one of the most brilliant minds I've experienced in my lifetime. And he's a man who always pushes the edges of theology. He does it not by pushing people down, but by pushing together with others. And we are very fortunate to have you. Thank you. Brian will give a more proper introduction. We want to thank the Lowell Institute because they have supported this event. And because of the Lowell Lecture, we are able to bring Mark and to have some really, really good conversations. I also want to thank Ray Joyce and Jacqueline Jones, who have made all of this possible. Jacqueline's been working for weeks, and she has done a brilliant job, like always. Thank you, Jacqueline. Brian Stone is going to introduce the panel, and I just want to introduce Brian briefly with a kind of strange kind of introduction. You all know him as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and you know that he teaches courses in evangelism, but there's some things you may not know. So let me just review some of the kinds of teaching he's done over his years here and even before he came. He is an expert in urban theology and ministry. He has taught liberation theology, not once or twice, but regularly, queer theology, theology and pop culture, John Wesley's theology, evangelism, film, that's part of pop culture, but it's kind of a specialty. And he has a very strange interest in horror films. He is the author of 2 books, one which has just come out and one which will come soon, and that's Evangelism After Pluralism. He's always pushing the edges himself. And the other one is Finding Faith Today, which is a culmination of a major study across the United States of people's lives and life experiences of coming to faith. Welcome to Brian Stone, and he will lead us in everything that's to come.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Mark Jordan, who is the Niebuhr Professor of Divinity, Harvard Divinity School. He's a scholar of Christian theology, European philosophy, and gender studies. And he teaches courses on the Western traditions of Christian theology, the relations of religion to literature, and the prospects for sexual ethics. He's written extensively for decades in the field of sexual ethics, producing books that are widely regarded as opening important new conversations, especially in regard to sexuality and marriage. And we have used a lot of those books here. Books such as The Ethics of Sex, Telling Truths in Church, Blessing Same-Sex Unions, Recruiting Young Love. He's also an expert in the field of Aquinas studies. But he's also continued to explore topics at the boundaries of philosophy and Christian theology across its history. His most recent books are Convulsing Bodies, Religion and Resistance in Foucault, and Teaching Bodies, Moral Formation in the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. Mark Jordan is a friend of the School of Theology, and we welcome him here today. Once he is done speaking, we'll have time for a question and answer. Thank you. Welcome.
If you all will forgive me, I'm going to take off my coat. Lecturing is sweaty work. Mary Elizabeth and I have just been talking about my closeted Methodist background. My grandfather was a Methodist tent preacher in the Texas Panhandle who went on to become a university chaplain. So my early memory of church is people in white shirts with the sleeves rolled up, fanning themselves with funeral parlor fans. They were always funeral parlor fans. Coming to lecture at BU School of Theology, I've twice had the resonance of a title, its effective sound, change for me between the talk's announcement and delivery. The first time it happened was in 2002, when Bob Neville and I agreed, though the suggestion was originally his, I think, that I would speak on Christian truth-telling. This was the title I set. By the time I arrived on campus, the Boston Globe had begun to publish its series on priestly abuse. And I remember walking to the lectern in a high room above Starrow Drive, sensing around me the electricity of betrayal, of grief, of skinned anger. Now, I said to myself, I begin to understand the bodily courage of truth-telling and truth-hearing in church. You can detect another change of resonance in the title this evening. When your dean, when Mary Elizabeth, we have been colleagues for a very long time, back from Emory days. When Mary Elizabeth and I corresponded about my topic, she wrote a gentle instruction, very gentle, as she always is, and very much an instruction, as it always is. She said, whatever you want to talk about is fine, but please say something about theology and sexuality. And I replied, I am struggling to finish a short book called Queer Callings, and I'd be grateful to share parts of it. I did not suspect that we would gather after such a destructive vote in St. Louis. But I now hear more of the resonance in these two words. They now address us with unmistakable urgency. Here's part of what I hear. Queer folks, including those most devoted to the gospel, have often had to minister to one another beside or beyond church walls. Even in recent memory, we have tended our sick, buried one another, blessed unions, welcomed new arrivals, taught and learned together, fed each other. We have had many allies, of course, and their numbers grow. We wouldn't be gathered here this evening except for a great cloud of friends. Still, queer faiths have often had to find their own way forward despite churches. This is part of the hope in queer calling. This is not a reason for despair. This is something we have done for centuries. So let's keep walking this evening. Tonight, I'll share parts of a book that I keep telling myself will be absolutely the last one I'll ever write. And I believe it when I say it. For those of you who've never heard me lecture, the lecture will have a lot of little parts from the book, and they'll pass fairly quickly in a kind of dream vision or constellation. And my theory is, if you don't get all of the parts, that's fine. Hopefully the dream makes some sense in any case. And I'm happy to talk about any part of it afterwards. I first conceived the argument of the book as an argument against our recent and uncritical acceptance of terms like sexual identity and gender identity. I didn't mean to mount yet another neoliberal complaint against identity politics. By focusing only on sex-gender identities, I hope to notice how the automatic labeling with an identity can lull us into believing that we've finished learning how to speak our emerging selves. After all, we only need to choose a label from the hundreds of recorded sexual identities approved by the internet. These definitions, I don't expect you to be able to read them. These definitions are the first dozen entries on a list compiled in 2016 from Tumblr blogs. Blogs and hookup apps being the advanced research laboratories for contemporary sexuality. So I regard this with absolute faith. Yeah. This is only the first 10 lists. This is actually a relatively short list. It only runs to about 75. But there is a list of 250 sexual identities. on the web. Instead of trying to figure out where I truly belonged on such lists, I set out instead to recall forgotten queer names, to retrieve older efforts at queer language, meanings, words that didn't fix things but multiply them, old words that didn't define our embodied selves but rendered them adequately mysterious. No, please, that I'm going to use the word queer without definition and for lack of any vaguer token. If there were a vaguer word, I would use that. I'm just using it because we don't have any other word. And so I'm using it without any particular meaning. So I begin the book by asking how and why we started talking about our embodied selves in terms of identities. And the interesting thing is that sexual identity is a term that moved quickly from rather dubious clinical projects to activist use and then daily language. So far as I can tell, its current meaning dates only from the late 1950s. That's the first actual definition I can find of sexual identity in our sense of the term. By 1970, it was spreading rapidly in queer activist writing, not least in church contexts, and by the end of the 1970s, almost everyone was using the term sexual identity, including the most conservative evangelicals. In a revealing paper from 1959, a psychologist, Thomas Colley, sets out to define total sexual identity by drawing together earlier scientific authorities. So the notion of sexual identity is produced by putting together various early meanings. And this paper is the earliest attempt I can find to define sexual identity in our sense. So Colley wants the term to combine Freudian theories of internal causes of development with later social theories of external causes. He stipulates that sexual identity brings together biological, psychological, and sociological norms. What's interesting, in the 1950s, as in the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, is that it's actually work on gender that precedes work on sexuality. So behind Colley's notion of sexual identity, there is the notion of gender identity, which brings us to John Money, who wrote his dissertation at Harvard in 1952 on the balance of physiological and psychological causes in people classified as hermaphrodites. Sorry. All right. Thank you. I have a very odd screen facing me. There's John. I want you to look him in the face. The dissertation's most famous claim, the dissertation has never been published. It's not available through Dissertation International Abstracts, but it is available in the Harvard Archives. And the most famous claim of the dissertation is that many people can adapt themselves to the sex of their rearing, whatever their physiology or genital anatomy. So for Money, how you are raised is more important to gender than bodily configuration or disposition. In the dissertation, Money uses the term psychosexual orientation in both narrow and broad senses. The narrow sense refers, as you can see, to individual erotic preferences, the direction and goal in which libido is exercised. In the broad sense, sexual orientation for Money also includes outlook and demeanor or outlook and deportment. In other words, it includes what we think of both as a person's sense of gender and gender presentation. Within a few years, Money and his co-authors shift terminology. They begin to write of gender role in a similarly broad sense, and after several more changes, Money settles on gender identity, which becomes the term that is paired with Colley's total sexual identity. And those two terms, gender identity, sexual identity, then pass very quickly into first political use and then general use. Those transits are still interesting to me. because this clinical category, sexual identity, with all the strange science behind it, spreads rapidly through the underground political press during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it's adopted by groups that were, at the same time, fighting against psychiatric definitions of homosexuality as a disease. So though they rejected psychiatric diagnosis, they embraced a term with an evidently psychiatric origin. What is perhaps more interesting is that the new usage of sexual identity passed almost immediately into progressive church writing. Let me give you two Methodist examples. In 1972, the Methodist youth magazine Motive, after breaking from the denomination over issues of sexuality, spent its remaining funds on two final issues. They took all the money that they had left in their accounts and published two final issues. One, a lesbian feminist issue, and the other devoted to gay men's liberation. The language of sexual identity appears often in the pages of both issues, its tensions on view. So already by 1972, progressive, especially younger progressive religious writers, are using the notion of sexual identity. But a more interesting piece of evidence comes from an essay by Robert L. Treese, who served, I believe, for almost 3 decades on this faculty. He helped the team of youth and urban ministers at Glide in San Francisco to found a council on religion and homosexuality. And in 1966, the council invited him to a consultation on theology, at which he presented a paper entitled Homosexuality, a Contemporary View of the Biblical Perspective. That paper was still widely cited up into the 1980s and 1990s as one of the first attempts to alter biblical interpretation, along with work that had been done by Sherwin Bailey in England and others. What's interesting is that when he first read the paper, when Treese first read the paper on biblical views, there is no use of the term sexual identity or gender identity. The term identity doesn't appear in the original form of the paper. But a few years later, when he was asked to revise the paper for publication in this volume, he inserted language of identity to paraphrase the biblical message. So with Treese's revisions, we can watch the category of sexual identity entering academic theology of sexuality between 1966 and 1974. It's like a before and after snapshot, because you can just watch it be inserted into the text. My guess is that Treese adopted the new terminology in solidarity with gay and lesbian activists with whom he was in conversation, because the activists judged the terminology of identity both most accurate and most politically effective. But in picking up their language, Treese and other theological writers joined the liberationists in erasing generations of earlier language, including much religious language, so that by the end of the 1970s, the language of identity simply takes over and displaces the earlier language. This is not a Methodist example, but Anita Bryant's best-selling book shows how easily the language of sexual identity passed over into supposedly biblical condemnations of homosexuality. Consider this quotation. God has ordained sexual identities, innate in male and female, so homosexuality is a twisting of divine order. I feel a little guilty attributing this quotation to Anita Bryant because the whole book was ghost-written for her. But this is what appears under her name in a book that sold widely and that heavily influenced evangelical discussions. So my book has more stories to tell here, especially about the counter movement to find a radically new language, or to recover ancient languages, in order to resist the prevailing languages of patriarchy. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that this rapid victory of the language of identity, its rapid adoption, has eclipsed these other much more serious efforts to rewrite language in order to understand gender and sexuality. Mary Daly is the obvious example, because from Beyond God the Father onward, she labors from page to page to find ways of speaking that will not immediately betray the emerging lives of women. And I think Daly's right, whatever you think of her particular suggestions. If you have been raised in the language of patriarchy, you have to fundamentally recast that language in order to be able to think gender differently. Another example is Judy Gran, who wrote the book Another Mother Tongue. She was best known as a poet, and she begins her book by quoting a line from Alfred Douglas's poem, Two Loves, a poem that was quoted at Oscar Wilde's criminal trial. I'll come back to that poem. But what is striking about so many of these early efforts to make queer language is that religion or spirituality is everywhere in them. Queer language is the house of queer spirit, or queer spirit animates the poetry, the language making for new forms of life in sex bodies. After much reading, I would say that the language of spirit has at least three functions in these authors who were involved in trying to remake language in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. First, they believe that growth into queer maturity requires something like spiritual exercises, rituals, or asceticisms that allow you to discern the higher meanings of language about sex. So the first shared conviction is growth into maturity requires spiritual discernment. Second, the spiritual exercises are invariably understood as artistic in so many senses. And so they're connected with art as a register for what exceeds our knowing or our managing. And third, finally, this queer artistry is often practiced as divine service or ministry. I know what I'm saying doesn't sound much like our story about the progress of liberation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what I'm saying is there's another story. And it's a story in which the work of remaking language is intimately connected with questions about spirituality and religion. I've tried to capture some of this in my title, which means, among other things, being called by your name, being called to a vocation, calling for in the sense of exhortation, and calling as crying out for help, in desire, with the hope of finding your kin or the invisible powers. And the short way of saying what the book is about is it's the effort to recover language adequate to speak queer callings in all of these senses. For the rest of this punctuated reading, I'll concentrate especially on queer calls to the invisible powers. The first thing I need to say is that the connection of queerness to spirituality is not new, and it is hardly confined to Christian churches. In English, for example, and I'm just going to stick with English examples, the genealogy of queer claims on spirit already has many branches by the second half of the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, you can already pick out a number of different branches of people working on the relation of queerness to spirituality. The obvious examples are Walt Whitman and his devotees. Boston was a hotbed of Whitmanism. I don't know if you know this, but there were demonstrations and parades and massive dinners when he came to lecture at Boston. He was very flattered. So Walt Whitman and his followers, including a number of Bostonians, Edward Carpenter and his followers, even the sexologist Havelock Ellis, they're all struck by the link between same-sex desire and spirituality, including within Christian churches that condemn this desire. One of the things Ellis keeps pointing out is, so many of the people I've talked to seem to be clergy. But let me pick out some particular names here. When Wilde explains to the court the meaning of the love that dare not speak its name, he's quoting a poem by Alfred Douglas. And he relies centrally on the word spiritual to describe what that phrase means. And at that moment, it seems to me he's closest to the meaning of Douglas's poem, because the poem draws a spiritual contrast between what we would call heterosexuality and homosexuality. I'll explore that a bit more at the end, because this poem has been quoted and requoted. It's reverberated down through these traditions of spirituality. For the moment, I just want to emphasize that the language of spirit appears both in someone like Oscar Wilde and in someone like Walt Whitman, right? And that Wilde uses the word spiritual to describe this form of love when he is defending himself in his criminal trial in London. Here's another example, more local. Some 30 years after Douglas's poem appeared, Boston's own Amy Lowell published her anthology, Pictures of the Floating World. I looked hard for a picture of her smoking a cigar, which she was famous for, but I couldn't find one. If you know of such a picture, I want it. And so Lowell opens her book with a quotation from Walt Whitman, that's practically a confession, and then turns to love poems that speak with little concealment of a woman's love for another woman, which is insistently described as spiritual. If you've never looked at Lowell's love poetry, I urge you to do it. I would quote it, except that I would blush. She can do more with midnight garden imagery than you would have thought possible. And in case you think that I'm spending all my time in unhealthy midnight gardens, let me remind you that in 1978, in an incandescent speech at a Women's History Conference at Mount Holyoke, Audre Lorde relies on the word spiritual for her most emphatic claims about the erotic. Here are some of them. So this many-branched genealogy of queer spirituality has not reached its end, even if it's been eclipsed in political movements or popular perception. Writers of queer spirituality preceded the homophiles of the 1950s and the liberationists of the 1960s. And I would say they also outlasted them, because neither the homophile movement nor the liberation movement achieved what it set out to achieve, although the homophiles came closer. I now want to move into two books to talk about this more closely. I don't think we can talk about remaking language in connection with queer spirituality without looking at language. So I chose two books kind of from the middle of my chapter on spirituality. In 1987, Gloria Evangelina Anzaldúa published Borderlands, La Frontera, with two women's presses operating in San Francisco, Spinster's Press and Aunt Lute Books. And can I just say, I don't know where progressive thinking would be without the feminist presses. That's right. Yeah, they're mainly gone now, alas, but so many of the texts that we depend on were published by them. Anzaldúa was then in her mid-40s and working as a university teacher, an untenured, a not tenured track university teacher in California. Her book is mobile. It is multilingual, moves back and forth among varieties of Spanish and English with some traces of Native American languages. There is a detailed outline in the book's table of contents, but the arc of narrative or argument is hard to trace once she gets going. I think deliberately hard to trace. The first part of the book intercuts autobiography with an academic monograph and then flouts the rules of both genres. The second half of the book is a collection of poems organized under 6 headings. The headings narrate a life pattern, but the poems seem to have a life of their own. I won't try to resolve any of the features of the book as if they were puzzles to be solved. Indeed, I hope to preserve the book's elusive strangeness, since strangeness is a recurring characteristic of queer spirituality, as of unexpected desire. So instead of summarizing Borderlands La Frontera, I only want to follow a few paths through its languages and territories. Borderlands is preoccupied with geographies, with land, with the people who belong on it, the words they invent for it. I don't know if you can see, this is an old Mexican map before Texas was stolen from Mexico, and before the Treaty of Guadalupe stole even more land from Mexico. So this is Texas and the Southwest viewed from Mexico before the border was there. Anzaldúa was born in far south Texas near McAllen. Along that reach, if you are close to the river or the Gulf of Mexico, you discover palms and extravagant animals, birds with red faces and rose throats and sulfur yellow bellies, and bodies of iridescent green-yellow with indigo heads. They are magnificent. And away from the water, you move through cactus, mesquite, guajillo, palo blanco, lizards, tarantulas, armadillos, javelinas, coyotes, and rattlesnakes, under a pressing blue sky with a spiked sun. The river, Rio Grande, Rio del Norte, Rio Bravo, is sometimes referred to as a natural border between the US and Mexico. As Anzaldúa makes plain, it is one of the most unnatural national boundaries on the planet. La Frontera is an unhealed cut through cultures and ecologies. The cut is, she says, psychological, sexual, and spiritual. The spiritual wound opened by the border reveals the historical, mythological space of Aztlan, the fabled Nahua homeland, the Aztec Eden. It is also, Anzaldúa says, the queer space of the atravesados, of those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal. So the land's sundering by this artificial border doubles the people born into it. Anzaldúa writes, but I, like other queer people, am two in one body, both male and female. She has the border running through her. Or in the local slang, she is mitad y mitad, half and half. As a child, Anzaldúa was bitten by a rattlesnake while working in the fields. Because she survived, she counted the bite as a claim on her by the snake woman, a serpent goddess, known by many Nahua names. With the bite, Anzaldúa is inducted as servant and messenger by a family of female divinities, the old spirit entities, she calls them. Sometimes she describes the claim psychologically as a mental picture and symbol of the instinctual. At other moments, more often, she accepts the claim as an entry into an alternate reality. I quote, "We're supposed to ignore, forget, kill those fleeting images of the soul's presence and of the spirit's presence. We're supposed to forget that every cell in our bodies, every bone and bird and worm has spirit in it. To be claimed by the snake for the serpent spirits is to enter into a lifetime of visions, omens, and messages." Anzaldúa possesses la facultad, the capacity to see in surface phenomena the meaning of deeper realities. Those who are pounced on the most have this faculty the strongest. Females, the homosexuals of all races, the dark-skinned, the outcast, the persecuted, the marginalized, the foreign. In short, in Anzaldúa, there is no gap, certainly no opposition, between the call of the goddesses and the political work to be done. On the contrary, the spiritual powers must sustain any work that would be effective. Just here, some readers of Borderlands object. Anzaldúa may have been bitten by a snake, just as she described, but surely the event cannot have had anything to do with spirits, goddesses, or visionary powers. All of that must be psychological. Why? Because they think the political excludes the spiritual. And so any reference to the spiritual must be psychological. But this reinterpretation performs a double erasure in Anzaldúa's text. It removes whole passages of her own understanding of her life. It also imposes a view of what can count as political. And if we had learned anything from Second Wave feminism, it would have been not to be dogmatic about what counts as political. Against the first erasure in the text, I suggest being less dogmatic about what can happen in this world. If you allow some surprises or merely suspend your positivist model of reality, you might turn your attention at least to Anzaldúa's language. Don't assume that you already know what she's talking about. Listen rather for how she talks, for when and where she appeals to the old stories about differently visible powers. If your model of reality excludes deities and divine gifts, perhaps you will at least allow that words about them can do things that other words can't do. You don't have to believe in gods to recognize the power of their dialects. And frankly, after all these years of doing theology, I think the least interesting question to ask about God is whether you believe in God. It's the most superficial question you can ask about your relation to the divine. But let me keep going with Anzaldúa. Against the second erasure, the familiar claim about what really works in politics, I suggest noticing how theology or mythology insinuates itself in what is supposed to be Anzaldúa's most political speech. We make better sense of Anzaldúa as the spiritual child of a lineage of spirit women, Aztec goddesses and figures of folklore, and the Virgin Mary, all of whom promise something new. Under their patronage, Anzaldúa combines geography, languages, testimonies, suffered history into a new mythology. If Anzaldúa is rightly claimed as an inspiration for political activism, and I think she is even more in this book claimed as a mythographer, a writer of new myths, whose lesbian loves made her all the more susceptible to ongoing revelation. That's the other thing I think we need to hear from Anzaldúa. Sexuality or sexual orientation, those are gifts for prophecy. That is what Anzaldúa is claiming. So Anzaldúa's desire for other women is also, she keeps claiming, a vocation in the oldest religious sense. The reader who resists this reading should remember that Borderlands doesn't end with a chapter on mestiza consciousness or even the call to plant again on the enduring soil. It ends with 100 pages of poetry, some in English, some in both English and Spanish, some only in Spanish. And the fifth section, called Animas, or souls, contains poems about resurrections, possessions, spiritual apprenticeships, hungry ghosts, cactus women, and sex with goddesses. Is this poetic license or a deliberate retrieval of anachronistic myths? Is it mystification? Or is the second half of Anzaldúa's book actually the more important? The place in which queer politics finds its most resonant language. Deep breath. We're leaving the Rio to go to the Bay Area. In 1994, a few years after the appearance of Borderlands, Mark Thompson published Gay Soul, interviews with 16 writers, healers, teachers, and visionaries. As some of you may know, Mark, among many accomplishments, was the longtime partner of Malcolm Boyd, famous for his, before he came out, famous for his early attempt to bring Jesus down into the flesh of daily life. Now, many objections can be raised against Thompson's choice of the figures in Gay Soul. I don't think the book is at all representative in any sociological sense. All of the people he talks to are cisgendered men. They're overwhelmingly white in some sense. They're mostly middle-aged, and we know what middle age can do to a person. I remember, and so on. So I'm not making a claim for this as like a representative sample. What I do think is that despite its evident limitations, Gay Soul stages a virtual conversation among a number of influential writers on gay spirituality. Most of the writers had been activists of one sort or another, and not just on religious issues. So most of these writers are speaking to these issues after many decades of political activism. And alongside Anzaldúa, I read Gay Soul as a claim about the insufficiency of political movements or their terminologies to sustain the fullness of queer lives. Whatever spirituality means, and it means many things in Thompson's book, the word almost always functions as a counterweight to models of social justice activism as the main point of human life. So whatever else the word spirituality is doing is saying activism is not enough. Activism is not enough. In most of the interviews, Thompson presses for a definition of spirit and soul. The responses vary wildly. Soul is what we used to call God, Andrew Raymer says. And Clyde Hall had something similar about spirit, speaking about the Native American traditions. He says people personify spirit as God, but that's only just one manifestation of it. But the most interesting answer comes from Harry Hay. He says that spirit is the richer or deeper term in comparison with soul. It is the distillation arising from the rich and bubbly brew in the pot, out of which new possibilities keep emerging. The world of spirit is made up of an ever-expanding continuum that finds new ways to touch and enhance the human world. Hay understands soul, by contrast, as an impoverishing abstraction. Other conversation partners in the book retreat from anything mystical or ritual to explain that spirituality has to do with the relationship of the individual to the whole universe. And then Joseph Kramer, who's the great sex activist of this group, the founder of Body Electric, and an advocate for all sorts of sexual practices as spiritual practices. Joseph Kramer says, spirituality for me is the basic question, what is life? What is the meaning of death? And that can boil down to, why do I breathe? So there's no agreement about how to employ the terms spirit, spirituality, or soul. But if they don't agree on definitions, they do agree tacitly when they use the terms to claim space for being queer in ways left out of most LGBTQ politics. So the definitions don't agree, but the function of the term agrees in trying to mark out this other space. I pick out 3 points of tacit agreement in these interviews. The priority of inner discovery over outward effort, the special vocation of the gay or queer, we need to talk about that, that's problematic for me, and the danger of fixed identity, especially with regard to gender. Let me just add a little bit under those points. Thompson sometimes ends the interview by asking what advice his conversation partner would give to a young man just coming out as gay. And I quote Thompson's gender specificity without endorsing it. That's the question he asked. And many of the replies pivot from politics toward spiritual practice. Ram Dass imagines telling the young man, please discover who you are as quickly and directly as possible, and don't get trapped in any of the illusions of your gay culture or the culture around you that they will try to project on you. Mitch Walker is most emphatic: for true initiation in gay spirit, the way to reach the stars is by going within. That's where the real inspiration in being gay resides. It's the most direct way of knowing God. But perhaps the sharpest judgment comes again from Harry Hay. He says, the development of the radical fairy identity is probably the most advanced form of the gay movement up to the present time. Okay, this from a one-time Marxist who founded the Mattachine Society in the early 1950s. The Mattachine Society is the archetypal homophile organization. So this is someone who spent his entire life doing political work. And he says it's the radical fairies, actually, who represent the most advanced part of the movement, because they exchange the ordinary politics of assimilation for a deeply playful spirituality of difference. In place of caucus meetings, fairies convene heart circles, within which it is possible to glimpse another way of queer life. The practice of fairy ritual is the most advanced form of political activity because it can transform participants into something like their future selves. The second point is the point about the special vocation of queer folk. And I don't want to dwell too much on that. I think it's a problematic notion. But I do want to say this, that I think part of the motive of that becomes clear when one of the participants, Andrew Raymer, who's associated with the famous queer synagogue in San Francisco, he's one of the teachers there. He says first that the job of queer folk is to save the planet, right? Which sounds very grandiose. And then what he says is, we are midwives for the dying. We are shamans. And it's the phrase midwives for the dying that reminds me of the presence of AIDS at the moment that these interviews was being conducted. And it makes perfect sense to me. I knew Andrew Raymer and I respect him deeply. It makes perfect sense to me in a moment when your community is dying and when you don't know if there'll be any response by the government or any medical response that will actually work, that you would say, this must mean that we have a special vocation. This must mean that we are called to do something special. Why else would we be killed off so brutally within the divine providence? So we can come back and talk about that. What I do want to notice is even when they're talking about the claim of special vocation, there is here, as in Anzaldúa, no shame in speaking about spiritual guidance or magical sensibilities, especially as proofs of this vocation. One of the poets who's interviewed in the book says, oh yes, I had my first vision when I was 4. And the angelic figure appeared to me and said, yes, you're going to be a poet. And I thought to myself, if an angelic figure had appeared to me at the age of 4 and said, you're going to be a poet, I wouldn't have even understood the word, much less felt an affirmation of my inner vocation. So some of these stories are just marvelous. The final point I do want to mention is the repeated emphasis on the danger of fixed identity, especially in gender. Thompson's conversation partners repeatedly link the special vocation to androgyny, a term which appears page after page. And even those who worry about the word androgyny propose radical rejections of the gender binary. For example, Hay speaks of spiritual neitherness. One of the other subjects says, if there are 5 billion people on the planet, that's 5 billion genders. So the rejection of the gender binary expands to include all the other identities that depend on it, in favor of a radical sense of individual calling, of individual self. And in the middle of a critique of fixed identity, it's Ram Dass who says, I don't think souls themselves have any sexual identity at all. So as far as our work is with souls, then we're clearly moving beyond that. This book, by the way, The Divine Androgyne by Purusha, was published in 1981 and widely circulated in gay spirituality circles. Because you really can't see the screen, you can't notice what it was that makes Amazon blur out the image at the center of that circle. All those naked bodies. If you look at Amazon and attempt to buy this book, this appears as an abstract, blurry design. But in the original cover, yes, those are naked male bodies. All right, a turn inward from movement politics, the claim of a special vocation, the appeal to androgyny against identities. These three claims, at least, are shared by the speakers in Gay Soul. And together they support exhortations to cultivate queerness as an insatiable desire that is never only about sexual satisfaction or even intimacy, whether long or short. If movement politics isn't enough, neither is orgasm conceived just as a physical release. Joseph Kramer, who speaks most explicitly about sexual practice as a means of enlightenment, describes himself not as a sex therapist, but as a body-based sex magician, or a magician creating a world that doesn't exist. So in many of the interviews, sexual desire is presented as a drive that powers a ceaseless pursuit of the transmuted self, free from identities and other imposed binaries, beyond the control of earthly powers, dissolved perhaps in divinity or the great self. All right, now a few conclusions. I could have written this lecture a dozen times over using different examples. There's a version of it that uses only work by women, another in French and another in Spanish, another with queer love poetry, which is filled with religious references, both Christian and anti-Christian. There's a version that reads only science fiction or fantasy, which, as you probably know, is one of the favored genres for working out queer theologies. And a final version that focuses on dance mixes of diva anthems from the 1990s. I was worried about the AV system. So, some of these examples will fit into my little book, though even the book doesn't have room for more than a few of them. Gathering such examples, I am not trying to produce a synthesis or a survey or even a summary. In that sense, I'm a lousy historian. I'm not really a historian at all. Because what I'm interested in is the different functions of the notion of spirituality in terms of opening space for queer lives. Any effort to impose a single definition overlooks what is most interesting in these texts, namely the different meanings of a word, spirituality, and how those meanings can authorize or protect different possibilities of queer transformation. To say that differently, I trust that all these mentions of spirituality that I've cited are not merely religious residue, like masked childhood yearning or compensatory resistance or anything like that. I think the word registers something of the giddy and frightening effort to write what happens when one puts oneself into the play of strange powers. These powers have not stopped. These efforts have not stopped because the aspirations they carry forward. Let me show that by ending with a poem that's echoed through so many of these texts, Douglas's Two Loves, which was published in 1894 in the first number of a new literary magazine, The Comedian. If you can read the cover closely, you'll see that Oscar Wilde contributed the first piece in this first issue of the magazine. Here are the opening lines of the poem. The poem begins with a presumptively male narrator describing a dream vision of a divided garden. We're back to gardens again. Its boundaries contain sun-nurtured flowers and others, flowers stained by moonlight and shaped by nature's willful moves. The curious flowers of the moon, mostly unnamed, they have drunk in the transitory tone of one brief moment in a sunset while watered with the scented dew long cupped in lilies. Amy Lowell must be just laughing giddily at this moment. This is so much also her way of talking. The petals of night flowers hold vesper light, but vesper light is also apparently the light of heaven, of God's glory, for never a sunrise mars the luminous air of heaven. Our narrator is not left long to decipher the garden's odd plan or the implication that the oddest flowers, the nameless ones, are nurtured by the light of heaven, because a youth appears, and where else but YouTube are you going to find a filmed version of a poem by Alfred Douglas? But I urge you to look it up. I can't do complete justice to the imaginative genius of this video in my short time. The youth has the attributes of the god Dionysus. His wind-tossed hair is twined with flowers. He carries a purple bunch of bursting grapes, and oh, naked all was he. The Dionysian youth takes our narrator's hand, then kisses his mouth. The caresses stop there, since the arriving youth has an important story to tell, or a moralizing dream tableau to present. In the tableau, two other youths appear. The first is happy, because he can sing the loves of girls and boys. The second is strange and given to sighs. Clutching night's blooms, he wears a cloak or wrought with embroidery of a fire-breathing snake. The sighing youth brings our narrator to tears, but tears cannot soften the tableau's moral. The sighing youth's sunny comrade denies him the name of love, insisting that he be called shame instead. With a final sigh, the insulted youth replies, "Have thy will, I am the love that dare not speak its name," which I take as in the poem as a pliant surrender to another mark of Cain burned into the skin. This figure dares not name himself as love, since he is publicly confined to shame. He names himself instead with an accented silence. He is the love that dare not speak its name. He is the personification of an always silent not loves. His sighs are the only remnants of lost words, of an ardent library destroyed to prevent publication, though the official story is that such shameful words cannot survive exposure to sunlight. The silence of same-sex desire is a very ancient image. It is already there among the founders of Latin-speaking theology. Jerome, for example, claims that the etymology of the Hebrew word Sodom means mute animal. And it's there in the appropriations of Ephesians 5:3, for those of you who went to Bible camp, which is about the unnaming of a particular sin. So Paul, you remember, warns his readers, you should not even talk about these things, much less do them. He's talking about a list of sins. But the tradition picks that up to specify one particular sin, which becomes known as the peccatum sine nomine, or the peccatum nefandum, a sin which has no name and can never be spoken aloud. Peccatum nefandum literally means the sin which should not be spoken. The venerable silence figures again in our image of the closet, which is perhaps more a place to keep quiet than to hide out of sight. I think the closet muffles sighs, sobs, and true names. In The Well of Loneliness, Sir Philip learns from a monograph of German sexology by Ulrichs what his daughter should be called, the technical name for what his daughter is. His daughter, Stephen, who prays to become a boy and already possesses so many masculine accomplishments, much to the chagrin of the competing males in the neighborhood. But the word from Ulrichs, the word that the father learns, is never mentioned by the novel. Indeed, Sir Philip keeps the German authority locked in his desk and sneaks in at night to read it. Before his death, he never mentions the bookish word either to his wife or to his daughter. The correct name, the true scientific name, is too awful, powerful, and final. Almost like God's own name. The silence imposed on Sodom has deformed Sodom's chosen idioms. If the history of queer language in Christendom is the silencing of shameful names, restoring it does not require shouting them from the rooftops. Our silencing was a crime, but so too was our enforced naming in clinics and in political campaigns. For advocates of identity and other reform terminologies, queer language must seek the best labels within the prevailing classification, or more ambitiously use the right labels to correct the classifying principles underneath. These and other ways of queering language have accomplished much social and political work. I know that. But I still believe that these names, and especially identities names, these names that have been imposed on us, remain fixated on a very limited understanding of what naming is. When they offer new labels to an existing scheme or reverse a familiar insult, they concede too much. If I take an insult like queer and reverse it into a positive name, which I have been doing all evening, as an identity or as an occasion of ethical understanding, I still leave intact the polarities of the larger rhetorical field that affirms the need for literal, transparent names. In my reversal of an insult, I have not contested the fantasy of naming, the presumption about how names are supposed to latch on to living things. Too often in queer speech, names attach like soldiers' dog tags, or worse, strips of plastic on toes in a morgue. Here is a body, and here is its registration, which will call up the right dossier. The languages of the clinic and the legislature, however reformed, still function by flattening. So many queer campaigns to reform speech are haunted by just such fantasies of inert naming, as if you were naming a corpse rather than a living being. In Douglas's poem, the video again, in Douglas's poem, names don't appear until the end. Confronted with the sighing youth who is brought into tears, the narrator asks for his name in order to understand his sadness. Like Dante's Walking Witness or Bunyan's Pilgrim, the protagonist of Douglas's poem hopes a name can be the key to the character and its story. Tell me your name so that I can figure out why you act as you do and why it makes me so sad to gaze upon you. And the youth replies, I am the love that dares not speak its name. I am. This name is not a proper name, like Sally or Michael. It is offered as the resonant name of a figure that is also a single person. It's like baptizing someone with a saint's name, only without any original saint. The narrator may want an explanation, but he receives a complex first name that presumes familiarity by denying it. Before it talks about names, Douglas presents another figure for queer love. Queer love sees the world by another light. Moonlight, yes, but also vesper light, the last glow of a stretching summer sunset, or else the magic hour when sunlight thickens to gold, orange, red, runs through the spectrum on clouds, tints the air, the light softens the edges of otherwise familiar things, blurs them, estranges them, and then for a moment allows a glimpse of their inner lights. I wish the said figure had said, I am Vesper Light. Last story. In 1961, Mark Rothko was given his first solo exhibition in Britain at London's Whitechapel Gallery. And one winter afternoon, as the light faded outside, he asked the curator, Brian Robertson, to turn off all the electric lights in the building. Robertson recalls, suddenly Rothko's color made its own light. The effect was unforgettable, smoldering and blazing and glowing softly from the walls, color in darkness. That is what queer language should look like, would look like, if we were not afraid to turn off the factory glare of mass naming, or the clinic's beam of number diagnosis, or the distorting spotlight of church condemnations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions, if you have any. And would you mind just taking them from there? Oh, we have microphones, so if you'll raise your hand, we'll call on you and we'll bring a microphone to you. Here.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciated it. My name is Nathan Bakken. I'm a queer and trans theologian and poet, and a lot of what you explained and shared resonated a lot with me. In thinking about particularly your last section about naming, I'm curious about the trans presence in your book, particularly around kind of the nuances that trans people bring, particularly to the naming conversation, that around chosen names, around birth names, around dead names, but also around the ways in which we build our own gender identities. So I'm not, I just want to ask for that.
Yes. So the quickest answer would be to say that there's a long section in the book on Maggie Nelson's Argonauts about what she says and what she doesn't say. But for those of you who don't know the book, it's a remarkable meditation on language while her partner is transitioning, only it's more complicated than that, and while she is pregnant and gives birth. But it's a very powerful meditation on how words attach to all kinds of bodies, not just trans bodies. And that's one thing that I try to lift up in what I write, that the questions I think that are named, that the questions that are brought forward by people in transition, with all different things that can mean, are not questions that we should pin on trans people. They're absolutely basic questions about the relation of words to bodies. And we should, instead of regarding them as somehow boutique trans issues, we should regard them as the gift given by trans experience of the memory of much larger questions. And this is also my understanding of queer theology in general. I do not think, if you understand by queer theology, theology that, that makes the case that you should tolerate people with same-sex desires, or that you might even want to occasionally ordain them. That work, that's been done. That's been done for so many decades. And it's just like when people come and say, no, but Romans 1. And I say, here's the bibliography of 50 books. We've had this conversation before. So for me, the work of queer theology is not to say, again, yes, you can be gay and Christian, or you can be lesbian and Christian. It was like when we used to have these fights at Notre Dame about whether women should be ordained. And I always said, no, the fight should be about whether anyone should be ordained in the Catholic Church. Right? This is the real question we need to ask. My point was not taken. So yes, But what I want to do is to say here again with trans issues, as with queer theology as a whole, what's happening is that these particular lived experiences are raising questions that Christian theology should never have ignored, but has ignored. And so the gift of the trans experience of trans theology, or the gift of queer theology, is the gift of questions to Christian theology that Christian theology can at last take seriously. Instead of running from bodies and running from anything that looks like a violation of the gender binary. We have so many trans saints in the Middle Ages, can I just say? I mean, no, really, they're all over the place. Yes, so thank you for that. And what I would say to you too is this, the field has always been small. I think the number of really powerful queer theology books can probably be counted on one hand. There's a lot of decent work out there and helpful work. But if you think of really great work, it's been very small. And to my mind, at least, we're still waiting on the first great book of trans theology. Again, it's not that useful and important work hasn't been done. But for my money, the reason I taught the Argonauts, Maggie Nelson, and the reason I teach Beatriz or Paul Preciado, is that there is no book of equivalent conceptual power and imagination available for Christian theology. So get busy.
Yes, Brandon.
Hi, Dr. Jordan. So I was very drawn to the phrase you kept using about queer spirituality. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of Black queer spirituality that is all over the Black church. Many times it's being used by persons who don't realize how queer it is. And the books that I was noticing that you put up, I was wondering, are there any narrative or stories or perspectives from Black queer perspectives? And if not, are there any works out there that sort of catalog that? I know there's one book about sweet tea. I'm trying to remember the title of it, but it catalogs some narratives. And of course, you have Baldwin and his work on spirituality. But it's really, you're really trying to make that connection because he didn't really name it like that. I'm wondering if that work exists. I'm looking for a hole somewhere for a prospective question that might pop up tomorrow.
There you go. Yeah. I mentioned Audre Lorde just because I love that piece. I think it's one of the most profound pieces ever written about the erotic, and I think it's frequently misread by omitting mentions of the spiritual. But in general, I didn't use African American material, and the reason, it's partly the reason of my own placement. When Sean Crawley was a student of mine at Emory, he helped me to try to do life history interviews in Atlanta, and I realized how fully I thought I knew all the gay bars in Atlanta. No. I knew all the bars in Atlanta that white people knew. Right? And so even just listening to Sean conduct these conversations, I realized how bad my ears were for listening and how blind my eyes were for seeing what was right in front of me. But my sense as an outsider is it's not just Baldwin. It goes, right? And it's not just Langston Hughes. It goes way back. The problem or the challenge in the Black tradition is that you don't have the split that you do in the white queer tradition. You don't have the formation of a secular space as the basis of white queer activism. That does not happen in the Black tradition. In the Black tradition, it seems to me the presence of the spirit, the religious sensibility, is much more deeply and integrally infused into the political work. So it seems that what I'm trying to address is a problem that's actually specific to the dominant white politics that have been done. And at least in my understanding, my reading of Black authors, it's not the same kind of problem. Right? Now, of course, as you know better than I, there are other problems in terms of articulating that. But having listened to Sean describe the queer glories of the B3 organ, I'm just utterly convinced that it's just all there. That there's a wholeness, I think, in the Black understanding of the relation of sexuality to religious and spiritual values that was sundered at the beginning of the liberationist movement. And I've read Kelly Brown Douglas. I know the questions about decency and the imposition of a kind of external sexual morality in terms of rebutting the charges. Of course, I know that. I'm just saying that every time I read, not just Baldwin, but all the way back, what I get is this much deeper sense of what I would call an incarnate theology. And it's precisely that, I think, that was cut out in white gay apologetics. Does that make sense, or am I? Okay. Yeah.
Thank
Good luck.
Anyone else? Catherine?
Thank you so much. My question is related to the end that you produced, and you had it it was the factory glare of something. I might have to ask you for what that was again. But also, and I think you also said spotlights of church condemnations, and maybe this is a question that I feel like I want to have an answer to when the pushback comes, if I am like talking about this. And it's, I know, I hear you saying there is a narrowing in the naming because this comes out of political movements. But I'm thinking now about how important it's been. So I'm watching, the criticism about candidates for a Democratic Party, and there's hundreds, and I can already feel the need to just, come together and get behind one and unify. This language of how the necessity to unify when there is a power that speaks so hegemonically. But I hear you arguing for just at this moment a really diffuse resistance of naming that got erased when it came out of needing to for political reasons, and that the church is a place where that can happen. And so I guess my question is, what does this give? Because if it's not about a political ends, is it just sort of infusing a new life in the church? And does it make a call on the church to do anything particular when it comes to naming?
Oh, good, thank you, excellent question. And you've already used exactly. I mean, I think there are three sources that feed into the narrowing of the naming. There's the medical clinical, there's the necessity of political organization, and there's the endless polemic of the church wars. And all of them tend to force a flattening. And for various reasons, it's been very important at one point or another to claim the identity. For example, it was absolutely essential to get homosexuality removed as a psychiatric diagnosis from the DSM in order to make political progress. Just as it was absolutely essential to get the sodomy laws removed in order to make the next step of political progress. But the funny thing is, that was all supposed to be preparatory, right? Winning our basic human rights was supposed to be preparation. Preparation for what? For figuring out the kind of lives we have. And if the churches were actually dealing with this question, and some of them are trying clumsily, nervously, because we make them think about sex, and any sex in church is very distressing, even though you want the next generation to show up, but you don't want to ask too much about how they got there. So I understand this. It's why most sex education programs in churches are bad. But look, this is the moment, it seems to me, when what we think of as the arts or the instruments of the church are what I think are most needed in the queer community. Because what I experience, not just in people of my own age or younger, but also in my students, is the deep hunger for meaningful life. Yes, I can have all the sex I want. I can get it fast. Here's Grindr, right? No one's going to throw me in jail for it. No one's going to deny me, or no one's going to say they're going to deny me a job for being out, and so on and so on. And now what? See, all of the victories we've won have been, in effect, negative victories, in the sense that they have removed forms of oppression. But removing forms of oppression is not the same as providing meaningful life. Right? And it seems to me this is the work both of queer culture and of the churches that want to be part of this work. Right? This is, I think, where the churches really could come forward. And I was, this is painful. I can't imagine how painful it is for some of you, but I was telling Mary Elizabeth that when I was down in Dallas over spring break, I was very proud to see two old line Methodist churches in Dallas, both of them located in queer neighborhoods with large, enormous pride flags planted right in front of the church sign. But what made me sadder was that one of them, the church in the neighborhood where I will be living, had on its front sign covered over the word United in United Methodist. And so there was the pride flag, and there was the Kessler Park Methodist Church, and there was the sign that said, not United Methodist, just Methodist. And so that for me, well, I know members of that congregation, and that was a sign for me of the absolutely unnecessary destructive pain that has been inflicted, right? But my hope, and this was my little homily, I'm not a very good preacher, this is my little homily at the beginning, which was, we've made it this far, right? We've been through a lot worse as a community. And what we need to do now is to keep pursuing the divine however we can. Precisely because without that, I think, the hollowness in us remains. Oof, now I am preaching. I'll stop.
Let's thank Professor Jordan.